in most cases, everyone in the lodge must agree upon a new member. This is where we get the term blackballed, that someone was blackballed. Because the way that it was often traditionally done is that to vote on things, you'd have two marbles. You'd have a white marble and a black marble. And if the question was, are we going to admit this person as a new brother, a can would be passed around and everyone would drop a marble into it. And in the end, if it was counted up and there was a single black ball in it, the person was not admitted. They were blackballed. Again, there are infinite variant because the lodge can do this any way they want to. They can make whatever rule, but usually you get recommended if your daddy was a Freemason, if you come from a long line of Freemasons, that helps. In fact, there's a special name for that. You're a Lewis. A Lewis is someone who is the son of a Freemason, and that doesn't guarantee you'll get in, but it certainly helps to a degree. There's also a term for nosy non-Masons who want to discover Masonic secrets. You know, people like me, you, people. Those are called cowans. Okay, so cowans. Sometimes they're called eavesdroppers, but a cowan is a person who wants to learn the secrets of Freemasonry without being admitted to the lodge. So they can make up any kind of rules that they want. They can set any kind of criteria. I mean, there are higher lodges that tell them they're supposed to do things, but they have no actual authority in most cases to make them do it. So each lodge constitutes itself, and generally they stick to the rules. If they do things like admit women, then they become irregular, and you know. But this is it. Nobody owns the rights to the name. There's no Freemasonry Incorporated that says that you can't set up something called free. Look, you and I could get some other guys together and we could call ourselves the Freemasonic Order of the Golden Centurion or whatever we wanted to. They couldn't stop us. All they could do is they could just say, they're not our kind of Freemason. We don't recognize them as Freemasons because they don't do things the way we do them. Close attention out there. Above my head on that bookshelf, if anybody can see it, there is actually a little thing there that says Illuminati. All right. Okay. That does not, I am not a member of the, if I was, I would just lie to you. But what that's actually from is from a wine box. There is a wine company in California called Illuminati Wines. And that is just a piece of cardboard which is cut off a wine box. But I deliberately keep it up there sometimes to see if anybody notices it. So yes, that's I've just given you away the inside joke. But that occasionally has freaked out a couple of people. It's it's no, it's not. But again, if I was, would I tell you? So the Illuminati. Well, let's start with the term itself. So Illuminati means illuminated. You've seen the light. That's all it means. You have been illuminated to something. What have you been illuminated to? You don't know. So this is another example of these things that appear to explain something, but when you look at it, it explains nothing. It's very simple. The Illuminati, or an Illuminatus, the singular, is a person who is illuminated. The Illuminati are those who have been illuminated to some information or truth, which remains unknown. The term itself, it's Latin, and it's been used for centuries before the Bavarian Illuminati ever came along by different groups. So if you go back in time, you can find groups in Europe, you can find groups in Afghanistan, you can find groups in the Middle East who called themselves, there was a mystical order in 15th century, what's now Afghanistan, called the Roshaniya. What does that mean? The Illuminated. Okay. It even was a term, if you go back to early Roman Christianity. Now, when Christianity was still a kind of underground sect in the Roman Empire, how did Christians refer to themselves? As the Illuminati, because they are illuminated. See, the gospel is illuminated. So it's a term that just means you've been made aware of some special information, and it's been used by lots of groups before. So we get to 1776, Ingolstadt, Bavaria. It's a university town. There was a University of Ingolstadt, which was a Jesuit university. The Jesuits were a Templar-like order within the Roman Catholic Church. They still run a lot of Catholic schools today. So there was a professor. He was not a clergyman. He was a lay professor of canon law at that university by the name of Adam Weishaupt. And one of the things that happened in the 1770s is that the Jesuit order for a time was banned. Basically, what happened to them, what happened to the Templars for a brief period of time, happened to the Jesuits. Pope decided he didn't like them, and the order was banned, which means that they lost control of the university, and it gave laymen like Weishaupt the ability to assume a higher position. He no longer had his Jesuit superiors riding herd on him. And so what he decided he was going to do is he was going to form a special secret order, which he first called the Order of Perfectibilists. But then, either because that was too long, he decided he would just call the Order of the Illuminati, the Order of those who have been illuminated. But that's not the real name of the organization. And neither was the Order Perfectibilist, because at one point he tells members of it that never let our order be known anywhere under its true name. And I don't think he's talking about the term Illuminati, which again is a very vague term. There is probably, now this we get into the realm, this is speculation. This is educated guesswork. So this is not a fact. But it would seem, if you put the pieces together, that there was, perhaps known only to Weishaupt himself and a few others, another name for this order which is never uttered or written down. It is simply those who are illuminated, because it's never mentioned. So we may not even know what this organization was ever really called to begin with. So what did Weishaupt want to do? Well, Weishaupt thought that the world was messily run. And he thought that the kings and the churches, things like the Catholic Church and the monarchies everywhere, were just kind of stupid. And what we needed was a whole new dispensation for the world. We needed an enlightened, remember, an illuminated order. We need to create a new illuminated elite which will lead the world and create a single universal order under the leadership of this illuminated elite. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to selectively recruit people. We're going to recruit a lot of them out of Masonic lodges. Why? Because people in Masonic lodges are already fairly important. So keep in mind, Weishaupt is not a revolutionary in the sense that what he wanted to do was to go out and get a bunch of angry peasants with pitchforks and torches. He didn't give a damn. Common people are completely meaningless to him. The people that we know, and there are membership lists that survive. There are people who would mention, so you can actually go and identify. There was a book by Terry Melanson, for anybody who is interested, which I think is called The Order Perfectibilis. And Melanson, it's essentially a kind of glossary of all the known members of the Illuminati. And he goes into their backgrounds, and there's 400 of them. There were more like 2,000, which again isn't many. But there are hundreds of them that we can identify. Well, who are these people? They are, first of all, many of them are aristocrats. Quite a few of them are princes, dukes. They're already rulers. But most are members of the aristocracy or of the professions or of the clergy. They are wealthy, influential, educated men. They are not commoners. Now, the reason for that is that what Weishaupt wants to do is to create a new elite out of the existing elite. And that's why he wants people. Well, you're going to create an organization which is going to subvert the existing order and rule the world. You want to make that out of farmers? I mean, think about it for a minute. No, what you want to do is you want to do this by infiltrating and recruiting members of the existing elites. You want to take someone who is a prince and sell him something that says that by becoming a member of the Illuminati, you will become even more important and powerful than you would as a prince. In fact, what you will be working for is to destroy the whole concept of princehood. And you'll be willing to do that because you will believe that this will be serving this kind of higher order. So he tells so he forms the order on the 1st of May, 1776. The following year, he joins a Masonic lodge. Now, does he do that because he really thinks the Masons are cool? No. He thinks that the Masons, his whole idea is that there's a lot of these lodges around. There are a lot of rich and influential people who belong to them, but nobody pays much attention to them. I mean, they're not suspicious. So what we want to do is that we will infiltrate Masonic lodges and we will take them over and utilize them for our purpose, and we will selectively recruit members for our order within them. We'll take them and we will work behind them in some way, but he has no respect for Freemasonry. He simply sees it as a useful cover for the activity of his group. So here you've got an interesting phenomena, which you can find elsewhere. A secret society which infiltrates another secret society to use it without the knowledge of most of its members for its own purposes. So what is Weishaupt's eventual goal? His eventual goal is to overturn all existing governments and religions and to replace it with a new world order, a rational, illuminated order. And to do this not openly, but through conspiracy, so that no one outside of the order will know exactly what's going on. And within the Illuminati, you have different levels of it. People at the lower levels don't even know that some of the higher levels exist. Because that's often the way that these groups will work, that, you go through different levels of initiation. Freemasonry is pretty simple. There are 3. But in some cases, it can be that, well, we told you there were 3 levels of initiation, but it turns out that actually there's another one. And you get initiated that, and you turn it, well, there's actually one, if you're special enough, there's one above that. You can also get this thing of that, well, remember what we taught you the last time, all that stuff you had to learn? Well, that's just all BS. All right, that was just kind of a test. So what we told you before isn't true. What we're going to tell you now is true. Except at the next level, you learn that, well, remember what we told you then? Well, that's a test as well. So it's always this process of ongoing illumination. And a part of that can be simply to say that everything we told you before was a lie. Now we're going to tell you the truth, probably. Or at least we're going to gradually reveal. The illumination doesn't happen all at once. It's at a certain stage, and we do this because only certain people are capable of this. Some members will be admitted and they'll stay in the lower levels because we don't think they're worthy to rise higher. Others, like you, will be picked to rise to a higher level, never knowing whether or not there's still some higher level, which there probably is. So, how did this Illuminati thing work out? Well, the Bavarian Illuminati, and that's where it was headquartered in Bavaria, it did spread to other countries, into Italy, into France, throughout Germany. Okay. Even people in America were aware of this. So when George Washington was quizzed about what he thought about the Illuminati in the 1790s, he knew all about it. He didn't like it. He thought it was bad. And he didn't think that it had too much influence in American lodges. But he thought that it had gotten there. So it had reached that far. It had reached all the way across the Atlantic. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, thought that Adam Weishaupt was a philanthropist and that the Illuminati were cool. So you get there in American founding fathers. Washington is on record as saying that he thought that the Illuminati were essentially pernicious, effectively evil, and a bad influence, whereas Jefferson thought that they were great. Okay, everything they wanted was sounded good to him. So it's quite inconsistent. So it did spread, but it only formally lasted for about 10 years because somebody, and I think this somebody was, this is again speculation, I think Weishaupt himself ratted out his organization to the Bavarian royal government. Why did he do that? To get publicity. So what the government did is it turned around and it banned it. And then it banned it again. And then it banned it a third time. Each ban getting somewhat more serious. Only in the last one were you threatened with death if you were a member of this group. But that again tells you something. When you have to ban the same organization 3 times, clearly you're not doing it right. Okay. So did it work the third time? Well, Weishaupt left Bavaria and just went to live in another neighboring German state where the prince was a member of the Illuminati, and he lived there and continued to write to the other Illuminati and to plot until his death in the 1830s. Okay, so this goes on for years, decades more. So you can say this formally, the Bavarian Illuminati was officially put out of business in Bavaria by 1786. Yet none of the principals in the organization were ever arrested. The organization was never destroyed. We don't know how large the organization was. We have no sense of its existence other than the fact that it did become widespread. So clearly it was not destroyed. So what became of it? And if we don't even know what its original name was, how do you know it would show up? And there were lots of people in the 19th century who would who believed that they were reforming the Illuminati. So this brings us, oddly enough, to Skull and Bones. So Skull and Bones, so you get to the 1830s, about the time that Adam Weishaupt dies, a couple of wealthy Bostonites, I should be able to remember their name. One is, I think, Alonzo Taft, and then there's another one. So, they both come from wealthy families. Remember, these organizations are not for the poor, they're for the rich. It's Yale, but where do they go on an exchange? Where did they get this whole idea from? Well, they go on an exchange to Germany. In fact, I think Bavaria. And it's while in Germany that they get the whole idea of founding Skull and Bones. And this is in its official statement, that it is the American branch of originally a German secret order. So it was brought back from Germany by the 2 men that founded the Order of Skull and Bones at Yale. They picked it up at the university they were in. Now, what does that mean? Does it prove that this is the Illuminati? Okay, that's what it is? No, it doesn't prove that. Does it create the possibility that it might be, yes, it does. But here again, we have to admit what we know and what we don't know. And the point is, we don't know. We just know these guys went to on an exchange to Germany and then came back and said that they're now going to take this German secret society that they thought was cool, and they're going to create a branch called number 322. Why 322? Is that because there are another 321 branches of this order? Or is it just because they like the number 322? See, this is one of these things that I call things like that a turd on a plate. Now, let me explain that. Let's say you just walk into a room, I don't know, your house, somebody else's, and there's a plate sitting on a table and it's got a turd on it. Now, I just bring that up just because that would be, your first idea was like, what the hell is a turd doing on a plate sitting on the table? It's not supposed to be there. It doesn't make any sense. But nevertheless, there it is. And you're going to have all kinds of questions like, well, who did this? Why did they do this? Is that a human turd? Whose is it? I mean, why would someone do this? You see the thing in front of you. You see the turd sitting on the plate, but you have no idea what that means, what it's supposed to do. And this is like a lot of the things that you uncover. So, Skull and Bones is a turd on a plate. It exists. It's sitting there right in front of you. And you've got this story as to where it came from. You don't know whether you should believe that story or not. I mean, you might as well go on, but you're just taking somebody's word for it. But there it is. It's not imaginary. It is a turd on a plate. Deal with it. So this is why you get so much speculation about these things, because everybody's trying to explain what that turd's doing on the plate. But that's the story as to where it comes from. And I think it's an intriguing possibility that there is some sort of link with the Bavarian Illuminati. It could be. But that doesn't mean that it is. So don't let that good story run away with you. It might could be. But what did it become? It became a very influential, or well, put it this way: Yale became one of the two most influential educational institutions in the United States. They still think they are. Well, I mean, they are. They got a brand name. That's what you're getting. I would just say, and I'm not saying this because I'm jealous because I didn't go to Yale or Harvard. One, I couldn't afford it, but two, I don't like the East Coast, so I'm not sure I would actually be there. Well, I shouldn't say I don't like the East Coast because you're on the East Coast, right? But it's not where I would want to go. But what they've got, they're very old, and a lot of important people have gone to those universities. And Harvard and Yale have a brand name because if you say I've got a degree from Harvard, that sounds much. It doesn't mean that your classes were any better. Man, I could virtually guarantee you if you took like a bonehead English class at Harvard and you took one at Podunk State University, that you're going to get the same thing. It's not going to be, but what you will get is you will get a degree that has a better brand name than Podunk State or the University of Idaho or lots of other, or all these other places. There you go. So this will be these were important training grounds for the national elite. People went through Yale, then would go on to have degrees in business, in politics, diplomacy. Yale and Harvard for a long time, to some degree still are the finishing schools for the elite. They're an avenue to other things. So the way that it basically works is that sometimes they're described as a fraternity, and they're not a fraternity in the usual sense because in general a college fraternity you join when you're a freshman and you go all 4 years or how many years you're there 6 7 you spend your whole time at college if you behave yourself in the organization. Skull and Bones like a dozen or so other groups on the Yale campus. It's not the only one of its kind. It's one of at least a dozen, I think, just on that campus. And they exist on other universities, are called senior societies. So you're only chosen to be a member in your senior year. And each year, only 15 people are chosen. So what happens is that at the end of the junior year, you're the idea is you get a knock on the door and there's some sort of secret message and that you've been chosen to be admitted to Skull and Bones, Scroll and Key, Wolf's Head, these different sort of groups where they might have. And you can turn that down, but generally because it's considered to be a privilege, you would tend to accept. But and so 15 people are admitted as a new sort of senior class of this group. They have their own kind of meeting house, which is famously called the Tomb. Okay, and that's this is, remember, like all fraternal organizations, this isn't part of the university. It's a private organization that operates within that. And there are all kinds of stories about what goes on, the stories about the initiations and, coffins and skeletons and lying in the coffin and reciting your personal sexual history and giving them all of the details about all of the things that you have done. Which would you do? Okay. There's an interesting question. If you were placed in that position, okay, you're going to have to tell us every incriminating, embarrassing thing that you have done. So one of the first things you have to consider there is how much do they know already? There's always that you usually get that idea. So we actually know all of this stuff. So you've got to confirm this. You've got to admit it. It's like a confession you're supposed to sign. Or is it just a bluff and you could tell them anything? Okay. You'd have to decide what you're going to do under those circumstances. So there are whole things about the rites of initiation, which probably operates something like that. But since we're not members, we don't really know. And then there's the whole thing that they have Geronimo's skull. Apparently, they have this whole thing about skulls because it's skull and bones. The idea is that Bonesman, I think, what wasn't this Prescott Bush? Okay, the Bush family. So yes, are there a whole series of Bushes as they go through? Yes, indeed there are. So Prescott Bush, the granddaddy of well, the daddy of the first Bush president and granddaddy of the other one, went back to Oklahoma, dug up Geronimo's grave, took his skull, and supposedly it sits on a shelf somewhere in the tomb. There was even one of that story became so widespread that one of Geronimo's descendants actually filed suit to try to get them to turn over the skull. Well, but that's difficult to do because he had no actual proof that they had the skull. He just heard a story that they had the skull, and they don't have to show. It was interesting. It was a way of getting publicity. So, do they have Geronimo's skull? Who knows? Maybe. It could have been. It could have been something like a fraternity prank, or it could just be a story that they came up with because it sounded interesting. But I wouldn't be surprised, if somehow I was to walk in. Well, first of all, you're going to go in and they're going to point to a skull, which, let's face it, they all pretty much look alike, don't they? Right. I mean, a forensicist could tell the difference, but to you and I, it's a skull. And if they tell you it's Geronimo's skull, well, maybe it is, or maybe they're just telling you it's Geronimo's skull. What's the better story? What do you want it to be? This is always where the good story comes in. Okay, they got a skull. You know, I've got I don't have a skull, but if I did, I could claim that's the skull of Lorenzo de Medici. I could say it's anybody's skull. And without DNA testing, no one would be the wiser in that case. So it's one of the things I keep coming back to the point because you always have to keep this in mind that you cannot, without, particularly when all you're doing is taking someone's word for something or you're taking a story for something, you got to keep in mind that you really don't have anything solid to go on. Okay, you could be given this could be the true story. Everything you're being told is absolutely certain, or it could simply be a pack of lies. It could be a good story which someone makes up because they know that people will believe it. Because that will then disguise the purpose of those things can be in some ways to divert your attention from something else. Right. No, that's true. That's true about life in general, isn't it? Okay. We don't know a lot of things that go on. It's a it's an unsatisfying thing. You know, the one answer that nobody, that I sometimes I think I feel like I disappoint or flummox people when I just go, well, I don't know. But see, that's the real answer. There are these different possibilities, but which one of those possibilities is true? I don't know. I don't have enough information to make a clear. I might think this one is if I could pick one, I think that's the better story, but that's not necessarily. That's what you've got to rein in some cases. If you want to the other thing to do is to try to find, I'm sure you found this, try to figure out the first time and place where this was mentioned. When does it go back? When's the first place that it crops up? Is it some newspaper article in 1910, or does it? That can always be really interesting. Is it where a term or where a story first appears? And almost always, when you go back and look at the first version of that story, it's not the same as the later versions of the story. It's changed, but it gets you back as to the kind of baseline as to what that would be. Um, there's it's you want an example of that? Okay, there is a famous or an infamous historical document. It's a real thing called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Okay, so you ever heard about the idea of international Jewish conspiracy? All right, okay, that's where it comes from. So the protocols, for short, or the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, appeared in the early 20th century in Russia, and they claim to be the notes of a meeting that was taken by some Jewish organization where they outlined their plan to take over the world. So anything you hear about this is what it leads back to. Now, there are all kinds of stories about where the document came from because the protocols are real in the sense that they appear in different forms. They appeared in a book as an appendix to a book in 1905. But eventually, and for a long time, it was believed that they were created. You'll have this whole story. They were created by the Russian Imperial Secret Police in Paris in 1904. And there was a woman who later came up with this whole very elaborate story in which she describes standing in a room watching these two men that she names copying things from one book into another. And she describes a stain on the cover of a notebook. She goes into great detail and this was supposedly the creation of the protocols. And that was and still is in many cases taken as the standard explanation of where they came from. But here's the thing about that story. It's almost entirely BS because she's describing an event taking place at a particular time at a particular place when at least one of those men wasn't there. Okay. So she's describing a person being there that you can prove was somewhere else at the time. And it's not even clear she was there where she claimed. So they wanted a story. So she came up with a story. And then what someone discovered is that the first version of the protocols, the very first one we know of, appeared as a series of articles in an obscure Russian newspaper in St. Petersburg in 1903. This woman is basically saying that they were created, that she saw them created in 1904, but here they are a year earlier, serialized in a newspaper under a slightly different name. And you can find different versions of the protocols, and sometimes there are 21 chapters, sometimes there are 24. They vary, the wording varies. I mean, they're all basically the same thing, but none of them are exact. It changes over time. One version is slightly different from another one. And the other thing is that that version that appeared in the newspaper in 1903, who wrote that? We don't know. It's just there. It's another turd on a plate. There it is. But we don't know where it came from. I think that the original was probably created in France. I think that part of that story is true. But by whom and for what purpose, it's not clear. It's another one of these things, it purports to be the notes of a meeting where you're discussing plans for world domination. So I ask you this. If you're part of a conspiracy which is going to come up with plans of world domination, do you write them down? Really? Would you do that? Would you need to do that? Reads like you ever see a Bond movie and you got the Bond villain who comes out, and at some point they go into this long exposition about what we're going to do. Ah, well, Mr. Bond, I'm going to do this, then I'm going. Okay, this is to explain to the audience so they can figure out what this guy's motivation is. No one in real life would do that. People don't actually do. So the protocols just reads like it's like blah. Now we're going to do this, and ooh, then we're going to do that. It makes no sense. Okay, no one would record things that way. But that has become an extremely influential document because people saw that and they believed it or they wanted to believe it. And that goes all the way from people from Henry Ford, who republishes that as the International Jew in the 1920s and distributes it in Ford dealerships all across the country, to Adolf Hitler and beyond, still come to this. So a document that doesn't even make sense for what it's supposed to describe, of unknown origin, has had huge significance. Sure. Well, no, this is what we know. We know that we don't have Hitler's body. Okay, so the corpse that the Russians found and for a time identified as Hitler's body outside the bunker is, through forensic analysis, conclusively not Hitler's body. To them, from Stalin wanted Hitler's body, so somebody said, "Okay, we'll say this is it." But no, nobody claims that that's it. So where is the body? I mean, you have no body, and legally, if you have no body, you have no proof of death. You have people who said that they saw his body, but considering that they were all kind of friends of his, I mean, were the people who in the bunker, the other officers, the SS personnel, and the rest, who would have presumably have lied to protect him if he was still alive. Their statements can't be wholly relied upon. They're not objective. They're not objective witnesses. So what they could be saying is true, but the body is disappeared. So could Hitler have escaped Berlin to Argentina or something? It's possible, but that's as far as you can go. I mean, frankly, I don't think there are lots of, that would be a lot more difficult than one might assume, but it can't be totally ruled out as a possibility. But the only thing we know is that we don't know where the body is. It's a mystery. Yeah. So that's, it's one of those things that since we hear so much today about fake news and disinformation, which are both real things, they always have been. Um, that's where you got to be. I would just suggest to people, don't be dismissive, and don't go at something. And I'm not standing from the standpoint of trying to debunk something. Somebody wants to debunk something has already made up their mind, and they're just going to go in and they're going to try to prove to their satisfaction what they don't believe and isn't true. But it's not an objective investigation. And this is the problem you find. If you're bound and determined to try to prove something or to make it look like you're proving something, that's what you'll do. You'll simply pick the information that supports your preconceived notion and dismiss all the others as unimportant. So you've got to keep in mind of just to let, in some ways, the story tell itself. Don't try to impose too much order. Don't insist that it has to go a certain way. And don't get too pushed out of shape when it doesn't seem to be going in the way that you thought it was going to go into. But because let's put it this way, nobody investigates anything without some interest in it. Okay, there's almost never total objectivity. You might have an idea that you would like to be the case, but just don't marry that idea. Not right away. Um, Keep an open mind. Try to take things back to the beginning. Treat things as a range of possibilities as opposed to things that are most bullshit will reveal itself after a period of time. You can eventually get a sense this isn't going anywhere. The thing to often look for isn't one person repeating a chain repetition of a story, but the same story coming from different places. So if you can find, let's say, two sources that don't seem to have any connection to each other. Now, there's no way they could have shared this story, who both seem to be telling the same story. That's something you should really pay attention to. If you find a third source, then you really need to pay attention to it. What period do I like? Uh, I have always had some particular, I said I was interested in Russian history and the Russian Revolution. So the early 20th century, the period around the First World War, has always been had a particular interest for me. Not I mean, World War II is interesting, but World War II in some ways is kind of a giant anticlimax. Okay. I mean, World War II is the huge bloated sequel to World War One. World War One is the original. And I find that whole period, when a lot of the things now, when aircraft, the world that we now live in is being formed. It's sort of coming into shape. Radio, electronics, aircraft, tanks, the whole kind of modern world begins to emerge for better or for worse, and in a lot of ways for worse. But yeah, that's the period that's the most interesting to me. Oh, no, it's okay. There we go. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Old buildings are much more interesting than new buildings. People put a lot of work. There was a lot of workmanship into that. It's similar. You mentioned that I was watching a thing, a YouTube video. What else? And it was talking about in Hollywood in the 20s. The sort of silent era when movie. This is the other thing, and the 20s are sort of the flip side of that First World War period I was talking about. But it was of all the early stars in Hollywood who would build these mansions in the hills, and how few of those exist. And these would be these, I mean, a lot of them are grotesque in their size, but these huge estates that were created throughout that area, and only a very small number of them survive. Most at some point in the 1960s or 70s were bulldozed for a Costco or usually to put in apartments of one kind or another. Condominium, and it makes you aware of how brief many of these periods are. That all the Oyster Bay is covered in mansions of the rich, but only for a short period of time, and then all of that stuff that was all the monument to that is it's just gone. It's simply recycled in some way. So yeah, Well, that's why we got to keep it alive, one way or the other. Um, yeah, a tremendous amount of stuff just does disappear, and but part of it is I think in a lot of respects in American society, there's not a lot of real regard for that type of thing. That may have some advantages to it as well, but things are just disposable. Um, the even this is one of the things you can find even perhaps more in the West than in the East, but a lot of towns, even small towns in the West, were all built around things like railroads, highways, and mines, or timber extraction, and therefore, once those industries move on, the towns just disappear. And you can drive, I drive between my house and, let's say, to Portland or Seattle, and you can drive through these areas of eastern Washington and Oregon, and you can drive through these towns that at one point, in the 1930s and 1940s, were small but sort of thriving towns, and now they're just basically ghost towns. And they're sort of kept, somebody will still have a cafe there, and it's sort of capitalizing on the fact that there used to be a town here. And it strikes me as to how fast all of that came and went. I mean, the whole town, which has an existence of a few decades, basically. Yeah, okay. Because there's always something that happened there. Yeah. Well, you're doing it now with your own way. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate that. I hope people find it interesting, and I hope that if they find it interesting, they might want to go. There's always more to explore. Okay, there's more details. The rabbit hole never ends. So yeah. Okay, so what am I going to plug here? Well, again, I'm retired. I still have a web page at the University of Idaho. That's probably not the most up to date, but you could find contact information there. And I want, if people want to contact me, they can figure my email address is not hidden. Okay, you'll have to search for it if you'll have to go there and find it. And as long as the messages are informative and polite, I will probably answer them. If they're not, then I'll just ignore them. So, what can I plug? My books, the ones that I think are still available in print, are Trust No One: The Secret World of Sidney Riley, which is all about an international spy. The book that I'm probably the most known for is Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. So if the name Aleister Crowley means anything to you, then you'd want to take a look at that. Uh, those are still available on Amazon. In the more historical side of it, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. So if you want to find out about financial skullduggery on Wall Street, surrounding the Russian Revolution, and there was quite a bit of that. You can find that as well. And then what I branched out into after retirement, other than books, are video series for the Great Courses. So some people may know what the Great Courses produces videos, usually taught by or written and performed by university professors like me. So if you just Google the Great Courses, you can see all of the hundreds of courses they have. But mine are The Real History of Secret Societies, which has individual episodes and things like the Templars and the Rosicrucians and the Illuminati. 24 episodes. Crimes of the Century, which are mostly about historical murders and assassinations. 12 episodes. And then Secrets of the Occult. So if you want a crash course in occultism, 24 efforts of Secrets of the Occult. I have just finished filming another series called Great Villains of History, which will probably be out later this year or early next year. And then the other thing, last but by no means least, a friend of mine and I, a fellow by the name of Stephen Austin, what have we done? Well, we started a podcast because we would sit around talking about things, drinking beer, and then decided that, why don't we record these? So wisely or not, we have done so. That podcast is called Strange as It Seems, the Strange as It Seems podcast, which can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Odyssey, and others. YouTube is probably the most accessible. I think we've got about 10 episodes out on a whole range of topics, including Aleister Crowley. And we're going to do one soon called Occult Hitler. Okay, because we found that if we put the term occult in the title, lots more people than it would otherwise. There's another one on the murder of the Romanovs and a whole series of things. So you'll probably find those interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for having me on, and you have a great evening. Uh, all right. Okay. Yeah. Ooh. Well, that should be interesting. Yeah. Okay. You too. My pleasure. All right. Bye bye.